This talk will not be like what you've been hearing so far. I'm not going to talk about algorithms or lots of kinds of details. Instead, I have some stories to tell about how certain things came about. Changes in viewpoints, changes in paradigms for computer-assisted molecular design. Okay, now. Okay, so the talk is dedicated to Corwin Hansch, who was the first person to make us realize that computers might be useful in medicinal chemistry. Corwin died about a week ago, so it's appropriate that I dedicate it to him. The longest story is about the development, the invention of quantitative structure-activity relationships. The first time that computers were used to understand biological structure-activity relationships. It started in 1948 with Robert Muir coming to Pomona College as a professor of botany. The same year Corwin came to Pomona, and Muir was looking for a collaborator to give him compounds that would affect plant growth. Was the golden age of chemistry, better things for better living through chemistry? So they collaborated, published a paper. A couple years later, the ortho effect. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Hammett effect appreciate where Hansch was coming from. This was the age that organic chemists were really enamored with Hammett constants. This particular review from, probably started in 1950, has 400 Hammett relationships in it. The interesting thing about that, from our viewpoint now, is Jaffe, in order to present these 400, he actually fitted all of those equations with a mechanical calculator and reported statistics. So this is the first time that statistics, at least as far as I know, statistics were applied to organic chemistry. And it wasn't quite a computer, it was those awful calculators. There was competition, though, to the Hansch-Muir hypothesis. A Dutch biochemist said, no, it's really the hydrophilic, lipophilic balance that determines which compounds are, or the relative potency of compounds. Unfortunately, the way they measured this HLB was pretty strange, with the effect of compounds on the dropping mercury electrode. Now, if any of you have ever done a dropping mercury electrode, you've probably repressed it. They also did a little bit with my cells, but it was equally obtuse. So the two groups published competing hypotheses in 1953. At the same time, Toshio Fujita was starting his independent career in the Department of Agricultural Chemistry at Kyoto University. And he read both of these papers and expanded on really both, more on the Hansch, but on some of Veldstra's ideas also. Published them in, this one's from a Japanese journal, but published at least one of them in Nature and 3 or 4 in JACS. Interestingly, by 1960, he wrote an internal report that's on the Kyoto website, but I had never seen it before, in which he said, well, both of these people are sort of right, but it's not complete. Neither of them is totally right. Okay. By 1960, 59-60, Hansch was getting very discouraged with that he couldn't do better with the Hammett equation. And he had a sabbatical leave and decided really maybe he should be thinking about this stuff that Veldstra was talking about. But in fact, he was clever enough to read more literature and decide that partition coefficients, specifically octanol water partition coefficients that Collender had promoted in the 1930s, he decided that was something that they ought to do. So he went back to Pomona. A technician started measuring partition coefficients. But as luck would have it, he got an NIH grant. I don't even know if he applied. I couldn't find anything about this. But you know, Sputnik had been up in 57, so the US Congress was really eager to support research at that point. Beat the Russians. So he got this grant. Now, maybe even the Americans don't even know, but certainly the Europeans don't know. Pomona College is a small liberal arts college. Its chemistry department has 5 faculty or 6 faculty. So Corwin said, well, no able-bodied American's going to want to come to Pomona for a postdoc. Maybe I can get someone from somewhere else. Well, Recueil, the quantum chemist who went on to get the Nobel Prize, had done calculations on some of the Hansch-Muir molecules. So Corwin wrote to Recueil and said, is there a Japanese person who'd like to come? So Recueil said, yes, this Fujita guy, you know, I know him, he'd be a good one. So this is really luck that someone who had spent a decade reading all of these papers and thinking about them arrived at the lab. And so here's a picture. Now let's see, is this how I do it? This is Toshio Fujita, Corwin Hansch, and a later postdoc, Wasa. And so that's how they looked at the time, you know, in 1960. Okay, so Toshio started working, measuring partition coefficients, and lo and behold, it didn't look any better. The correlation with log P didn't look any better. There seemed to be an optimum, so they knew they needed to have a nonlinear equation. And as the story, well, as both Hansch and Fujita say, Toshio was the one that said, you know, we should have a multivariate equation. We should follow what Taft did, who separated steric and electronic effects. We should separate hydrophobic and electronic effects and come up with an equation. Well, that's all great, but you're going to do a 3-variable equation plus an intercept on a manual calculator? I mean, it was bad enough to do 2 properties instead of 3. Well, this is where real luck came in. Pomona had a professor, Donald McIntyre, in the geology department, and he was enamored with computers. He had one of these Clary computers that he was using himself, and convinced a donor to give another computer to the chemistry department. Well, the chemistry department, they didn't have room for it, you know, but you know, what are they going to do with a computer? Well, in fact, they needed a computer to solve this equation, and McIntyre worked to program it. You're not seeing much. I think this is the output and the input, but underneath are the boards, and as I understand it, the way it works, you had to swap boards in and out in order to do the equation, and there were 3. One board to read it in, another to invert the matrix and do all the good stuff, and then a third to get the output. Just to show how important it was, this is from one of Corwin's papers when he got an award. And this is really, as chance would have it, McIntyre's help in writing our first program was crucial, as I had no thought of ever needing a computer. McIntyre went on to be one of the big proponents of APL. I don't know how many people remember that very obtuse programming language. And then there was something that evolved after it. McIntyre stayed at Pomona his whole career, but he was a Scotsman, so every summer he went back to Edinburgh. And there's a wonderful website that collects a lot of his things. So that's where I got that picture. So the first paper comes up, 1962. It's now 14 years from when they started this work. They finally have an answer. So that's where the persistence comes out in my title. But also note, McIntyre's not an author, even though, you know, they were very much aware they couldn't have done it without him. So in those days, if you didn't do lab work or deep thinking, you weren't an author. Okay, so this is one equation. I think there are 11 compounds in the correlation. A year later, they expanded the series. Muir fairly early went back to the University of Iowa to become a professor, but apparently they were still sending compounds back and forth. There were more compounds in this, and they correlated a second series. But it wasn't till, ooh, okay, that's pi, rho, sigma. You don't have the fonts either, sorry. This is the paper then that really started QSAR in thinking about computers. By this time they were using an IBM. This became a citation classic. You know, by 1976 it had a couple thousand citations. At the same time, those of you who care about CLOGP, they had another, same year, they had another paper, a new substituent, this is pi, derived from partition coefficients. So showing that CLOGP is an additive constitutive property. So this is just the summary of QSAR invention. So persistence, 16 years from when they started until they really had the new method. But inspiration, because certainly when Hansch and Muir started, they did not think that this was going to be some wonderful method that both Hansch and Fujita spent the rest of their career following. And then, of course, luck, because it was lucky both that Fujita ended up in Hansch's lab, but also that McIntyre was sitting there with a computer waiting to be used. So it's a lot of fun to think about this, and I have a lot more details if people are interested. But I know this group, you know, maybe you care about QSAR. Maybe you don't. You don't care about computers. But you really care about smiles. Everybody cares about smiles. If you haven't met Dave Weininger, that's sort of how he looks, but this picture really doesn't show his nice bushy hair, and usually his beard is bigger than that too. He also has hairy legs when he wears shorts, you know, it's real cute. Well, and arms, yeah, you don't see his arms. A total character. Smiles is a rather short story. It starts with Dave doing a PhD in the Department of Water Chemistry at the University of Wisconsin. And his project was to measure PCBs in lake trout and to figure out things about them. And he started, you know, doing his mass spec, measuring the PCBs. And one day he did a calculation and he realized he would have to catch all of the fish in Lake Michigan, which is a huge lake, you know, to European standards, it's a huge lake. He'd have to catch all the fish. Well, this is not exactly ethically responsible, as well as probably being practical to do. So he came up with a model to explain how PCBs distribute in the various phases, as it were. in an aqueous environment. Well, the Environmental Protection Agency liked this model, and they said, come work for us. Come to our Duluth branch, where they are measuring toxicity of compounds to fathead minnows. And come there and help us organize our structure activity, make a database for our structure activity relationship. These are pictures of GT40s. So Dave wrote a program, a GT40, it had this wonderful thing called a light pen. So you sat at the computer with a light pen and would draw the structure in. And then there's a keyboard, so if you needed a nitrogen, you'd put the light pen at the point, and then you'd hit an N on the keyboard. So it was an amazing thing at the time, the GT40. When I first saw it, I couldn't believe it. I was ready to buy digital equipment stock when I first saw it. So he wrote this program, and there were people entering structures. Now, many of you don't think about the old days when we didn't have any structures in the computer. How did they get there? Well, it was, in many cases, people drawing them in this way. Well, one day Dave walked into the computer room, and people weren't using the light pen, they were typing. And he said, what are you typing? Well, they had decoded how he transformed those coordinates on the GT40 into computers. And he said, oh man, I don't like that. And so the way he told the story to me, he went home that night and invented the first version of Smiles. And the name comes from the smile on the faces of the people who actually could use it then. They didn't have to figure out this crazy thing that he had done so wonderfully. So now, of course, Smiles developed and became much more formal as time went on. So in this case, the invention was really insight and inspiration. It wasn't, a long slug. This is Al Leo, if you haven't met him. This scribbling over here says the old way that we would calculate partition coefficient. You had to know all kinds of crazy things, make a correction for this and that. And Dave, yeah, that's actually, it's full screen and everything. Dave decided, well, Al has all this stuff in his head. What I want to do is capture all that expert information into a computer program. And so that is what he did with CLOGP, which is really the reference program. It wasn't the first, but it's really the reference program for calculating octal water partition coefficient. And this was not an easy task to do CLOGP. He had to invent smarts and do a whole lot of stuff to actually come to doing it. So I would say in this case, it's perspiration, but inspiration to actually capture this crazy guy who could calculate partition coefficient. All right, so look at that screen. The offspring of that effort then is the BioBite company from whom you would buy the CLOGP and the database behind it, and a database of Hansch equations, and then of course Daylight. Long story about how Daylight came to be. Okay, both of these work. So in the 1980s, I moved from doing QSAR to doing 3D modeling. And part of the game was to propose a Pharmacophore, the common 3D structure between atoms that would be interacting with a biomolecule. to propose what's common between all of the active compounds. And so that's fine, we could sort of do that. But the question always was, from the organic chemist, well, what is it that I put in to hold those points? You know, some are published, some we know about, but what can I do that's novel? And I never had a way to answer that question. In order to keep our modeling 3D structures together, we had worked with Dave to have a database in which we kept our 3D structures. And this was really cool. I think even today, people with modeling programs don't have all the capabilities. We could specify which atoms to superimpose by a smarts target, you know, and just go through the whole set. It was really nice, but it was built on a VAX, which, okay, so we had this database, but we really couldn't do what we wanted to with it. And one day I gave a talk at a local ACS meeting, and this nice young man, John Van Drie, came up and started to talk with me. He was at that point an independent computer contractor, and he said, you know, you must have something you need done that you could hire me for. And I was impressed. He was smart and you know, seemed to know different things than I did. So I convinced my boss that we should have a small contract with him. The contract was for 2 days a week for 3 months. And then, okay, I've got to come up with something for him to do. Well, back to that old problem, I thought, well, he should be able to figure out how to search that database that we had by 3D substructure. So, in the end, we came up with a program called Aladdin, and it really does 3D searching. It was three different groups came up with 3D searching at the same time. Before that, no one had thought about being able to do. And each of us approached it somewhat differently. So it was Peter Willett and Bob Sheridan. So I would consider Aladdin inspiration, because I knew what the problem was that was floating around for which we didn't have a solution. But then it was also luck that John Van Drie walked by. You know, we could have done it at Abbott. I could have put my programmer on it, but somehow having John there and with a specific problem made it happen. Now the next story is really amazing. We were using Evans and Sutherland graphics terminals, and Evans and Bob Pearlman, who I knew from his work on solvation, had been working a way to figure out a way to generate 3D structures for his studies on solvation. Evans and Sutherland heard about that, and they thought, well, maybe this program that generates 3D structures, maybe that would be useful to somebody else. So they trotted into Abbott one day with Bob and showed us CONCORD, and I put my favorite molecules through and was totally amazed what a good job it did. And then we showed Bob Aladdin, and he was totally amazed that his program might be useful for something beyond what he was doing. So at that moment, we realized we could make a database of thousands, well, we were thinking thousands, hundreds of thousands of structures, just starting with SMILES, get 3D with CONCORD, search them. So in that moment, we realized 3D searching was born, and it was, in this case, it's just happenstance. It's totally separate developments come together to solve a problem that people hadn't really realized they had before. Okay. During this time, we'd been doing 3D modeling, but we also then started to do 3D QSAR. And if we could get a 3D QSAR, it was very powerful, but the problem was that for many sets of molecules, we couldn't figure out how to align them for COMFA. I knew Peter Willett because he had written one of the programs for 3D searching, and I had read a fair number of his papers. One day I was homesick, and I thought, okay, I'm going to read some of these papers that I should have been reading all along. There was a paper by Brent and Willett on comparing algorithms to find the maximum common 3D substructure. And I thought, who wants to do that? You already know, because they were looking at connected atoms. You already know if it's, from the 2D, you already know which ones are going to have 3D. And then in my haze of flu, I realized, oh, but a pharmacophore is really like a maximum common substructure. It's just that the points are connected by bonds. They're just distances between them. And so that led to our program DISCO, which solved another problem people didn't know they had, and that was how to perceive a pharmacophore within a set of molecules. Before that, you had to tell the programs which atoms corresponded to which in the different molecules. So that's inspiration and happenstance. You know, it just happened I read that paper at a time that I was worrying about that problem. So in summary, I just say that many of these paradigm-changing inventions, many of them involved a lot of work, but a lot of them didn't. Insight, sort of seeing something different that could be done with what we already know, and a fair element of luck. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of these experiences privately. Thank you.
Thank you very much.